I was 23 when this happened. At the time, I had just graduated college. I was between jobs and doing odd work around my small town, like pet sitting, yard work, grocery shopping for elderly neighbors, basically anything that paid cash. A woman I had done dog walking for in the past recommended me to a friend of her co-workers, a man named Robert. He called me one evening and explained he'd be traveling for a week and needed someone to stay in his house to look after his chocolate lab, named Scout. He said Scout was a nervous dog who did best with someone actually staying overnight rather than just dropping by to check on him, and the pay he offered was better than usual, so I agreed. I met Robert 2 days later. He was in his mid-40s, average height, wearing thick-rimmed glasses and a denim jacket. Nothing about him seemed off at first, maybe a little too chatty, but not unsettling. His house was on the outskirts of town, nestled back among tall pine trees. The place itself was decent, but clearly hadn't been updated in years. Think wood paneling and paisley wallpaper. Robert walked me through everything. Scout's feeding schedule, where the emergency key was hidden, which pantry items I was welcome to. He told me I could stay in the spare bedroom, which was just off the main living area on the ground floor. I started the job on a Tuesday. The first 2 nights went smoothly. I watched Netflix in the living room, took Scout on his nightly walks around the neighborhood, then slept in the spare room with him sprawled across the foot of the bed. It was the 3rd night when everything changed. I had been lying in bed checking social media when something caught my eye. On the nightstand across from the bed, next to a ceramic table lamp, was a digital clock radio. I remembered thinking it looked out of place, sleek silver with a bright green LED display, while everything else in the room looked like it belonged in the 1990s. I'm not sure what drew me to examine it more closely. Maybe it was how the lamplight reflected off its surface. But as I got up for a closer look, I spotted a small, perfectly round, dark spot above the time display. Initially, I assumed it was just a speaker hole, but then I noticed the positioning. The tiny opening was aimed directly at the bed. My blood went cold. I had heard horror stories about hidden cameras disguised as everyday objects, but I'd never encountered one myself. My thoughts began spiraling. I picked it up and it felt heavier than it should have, with a quiet humming sound inside like a small motor running. I turned it toward my face and stared straight into that dark opening. That's when Scout, who had been resting near the doorway, suddenly raised his head and began whimpering. From somewhere else in the house, not the main entrance, but from the back of the house, I heard the distinct sound of a door shutting. Every nerve in my body fired at once. Robert wasn't supposed to return until Saturday, and this was only Thursday night. I went rigid, clutching the clock, my pulse hammering so violently I could feel it in my temples. Then I heard measured footsteps on the carpeted hallway. I quickly placed the clock back and rushed to the door, turning the lock just as the footsteps came to a halt outside. Then Robert's voice came through, steady but slightly breathless. He was explaining that he had forgotten something in the room from his last visit and needed me to unlock the door. I couldn't find my voice. A moment later, he said it wasn't what I was thinking, insisting it was a motion detector for Scout and that he hadn't wanted to worry me by bringing it up beforehand. I stepped back from the door, my palm pressed against my mouth. He urged me to come out so we could discuss this rationally, but when I remained silent, his gentle knocking became aggressive banging. He demanded I open the door, his voice no longer measured, but harsh and demanding. Scout began barking and pawing at the door, which only seemed to escalate Robert's agitation. I looked toward the window, which was low enough to climb through, but it was latched shut. I struggled with the mechanism, my hands trembling so violently it took several attempts to get it open. Behind me, Robert continued his assault on the door, now threatening that if I didn't unlock it, he would retrieve his master key and contact the police, claiming I had broken into his property. I didn't stick around to hear the rest. I forced the window open, climbed through clumsily, and tumbled onto the grass below. Scout tried to follow me, his claws scraping against the windowsill, but he ultimately stayed inside and didn't make the jump. I sprinted across the side lawn and down the dirt driveway until I reached the main road. My phone was in my jacket, and I called my mom, who lived about 20 minutes away. I told her to pick me up immediately. By the time she arrived, I was crouched behind a row of mailboxes. Robert's house was hidden from view at that distance, but I kept glancing back nervously. I spent the rest of the night at my mom's place. The following morning, I blocked Robert's number and contacted an attorney. The lawyer explained that without concrete evidence like footage from the device or the camera itself, filing charges would be challenging. Even if the clock contained a hidden camera, Robert could argue it was an innocent security feature. And without proof, it would come down to my testimony versus his. I considered going back to photograph it, but my lawyer strongly discouraged returning to the house alone, and the thought of facing Robert again made me nauseous, so nothing came of it. I never received payment for the 3 nights I worked there. The woman who had referred me to him stopped answering my calls, and I never learned whether she had any knowledge of his behavior. For months afterward, I had recurring nightmares about discovering a camera lens watching me from across a dark room. I began obsessively inspecting every electronic device in my own apartment: clocks, smoke alarms, decorative objects. And I still think about that moment when I stared into that tiny black opening and heard the door close somewhere behind me in what I believed was an empty house, which tells me he might have been there the entire time, observing me through that camera.